Today is Tuesday, 24th September, and together with my friend and colleague Alex Cristoforo, I continue to be in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia, an astonishing city, a beautiful city in many places, if I may say, amazing service, amazing culture. We're having an absolutely wonderful time here, and we're also working, I should say, very hard and meeting, and will be meeting all sorts of people. So time is constrained, as I said, I'd have time constraints, but as you can see, I'm in Malaysia and I'm making this program from my hotel room. And though I am rested by comparison with how I was yesterday, and though this video will no doubt be longer than yesterday's, and perhaps a little more coherent than yesterday's, nonetheless, I do have time constraints, and it won't be as long, I expect, as some of my more usual videos are. That's just to say. Well, let's look at the situation in the world today, and most of this program will be about the situation in Ukraine and about President Zelensky's activities in the United States, where he's currently present, preparing to attend the New York General Assembly, UN General Assembly session in New York, and where he expects to be meeting Western leaders. But I think I should just say that the situation in the Middle East is again becoming extremely dangerous. We've had a massive Israeli airstrike on Lebanon, targeting, as the Israelis say, Hezbollah facilities. The Hezbollah appears to be standing its ground. They're launching counter-rocket strikes into Israel. Prime Minister Netanyahu is telling people to leave Lebanon. It looks as if some major military operation is being prepared, and more likely than not, sometime soon, maybe tomorrow, maybe next week, we will probably see Israeli ground troops enter Lebanon and the fighting intensify there. The Iranian government has again made clear that it does not want to see a general conflagration in the Middle East, but of course it continues to support its Lebanese allies, Hezbollah and the others. And of course, the situation remains tense. And as I've discussed in several programs, my own clear view, is that this confrontation with Hezbollah, whilst it might have immediate objectives, there are thousands of people in northern Israel who are not able to return to their homes because of Hezbollah shelling. But my own view is that the ultimate objective and probably result will be some kind of conflict between Israel and Iran. Now, I will turn to all of that in future programs, because the news coming out of Ukraine, and by the way, New York as well, where President Zelensky either is or will shortly be, is fairly dramatic and reinforces my belief that we are now very much in an endgame type situation. Suffice to say that President Zelensky has again categorically ruled out negotiations with the Russians. He has said that Ukraine does desire what he calls a diplomatic solution, but that diplomatic solution apparently is to be achieved without negotiations with the Russians, which begs the question of what kind of diplomatic solution in that case it can be. I suspect that many countries around the world will be asking that very same question, but if you are familiar with President Zelensky, it's not ultimately difficult to understand what he's trying to do. He's talking about his plan A, which is his victory plan, which he has presented to the Americans, or at least is going to, and to the Europeans. And I've discussed in many places what Plan A is, that it is essentially membership of NATO. And he says that if Plan A is rejected, Ukraine is still not going to negotiate. It is going to continue with Plan B, which is, in other words, the war, the ongoing war that Ukraine is fighting and losing against Russia at the moment. Negotiations of any kind, apparently, are out of the question. He wants a diplomatic solution, but he wants a diplomatic solution without negotiations. And as I said, it's not difficult to understand what he's talking about. He has said that Plan A was something that he proposed before February 2022, when the conflict began, and that, I think, gives away the clue. Gives the clue. The Plan A is immediate Ukrainian entry into NATO. He assumes, as others do, Boris Johnson, for instance, that if Ukraine is admitted into NATO, the Russians will clutch their foreheads in horror. They will say, that's it. We can't go on. If we go on, we will be taking on the whole of NATO, and they will call off the special military operation, and they will immediately and instantly plead for peace. And that will be peace on Zelensky's terms, following the Zelensky formula being that the Russians agree without conditions to withdraw from all the territory they occupy in pre-2014 Ukraine, including, of course, Crimea and Donbass and Zaporozhye and Kherson region and all of these places, that they immediately withdraw. And once they have withdrawn and agree never to attack Ukraine ever again and accept Ukraine's territorial integrity, then negotiations can begin on such matters as the scale of the reparations that Russia will pay, the degree of demilitarization it will accept. Some Ukrainians have in the past, I understand, talked about Russia being deprived of all of its nuclear weapons arsenal. I seem to recall that very thing was once proposed. Perhaps its seat in the UN Security Council. I recall definitely that some people in the West floated that idea. I don't know whether the Ukrainians have. And that, of course, Russia also agreed to war crimes trials of Russian leaders, including presumably President Putin himself. Now, I say all of that. I don't think any of that is remotely going to happen if the Western countries took the decision to admit Ukraine into NATO immediately. I think that the Russians would conclude that they have no choice but to go on, and the war would continue, and then the NATO countries would be confronted with a very difficult situation, which is, do they agree to Article 5 being invoked by Kiev, as presumably it would be, and do they then enter into a direct war with the Russians, something which Western leaders have continuously and repeatedly ruled out, and something which Western publics have made clear they overwhelmingly oppose. I saw just yesterday an opinion poll in Germany, a country to which I will return later in this program, which showed that over 60% of Germans unequivocally oppose the delivery of Taurus long-range missiles to Ukraine, for example, because they see that as an escalatory step. So just imagine how they would respond if Ukraine were to enter NATO and were then to ask the NATO countries, including, of course, Germany, to go to war, to actual war on their behalf. And I think in Britain, in France, in Italy, in the United States, it would be exactly the same. The alternative would be that when Zelensky came along and invoked Article 5 and asked NATO to intervene, the Western powers, hiding behind the language, the actual language of Article 5, which does not say that they need to go immediately to war on behalf of Ukraine, the NATO countries would find some reason or argument not to intervene, in which case NATO would suffer a blow to its credibility from which I cannot imagine it would ever recover. So I think the Americans understand this. I think even President Biden understands this. I think even his Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, understand this. And for that reason, I think this proposal will be refused. Now, it's interesting, however, that Zelensky says that Plan A had previously been proposed by him and by Ukraine before the current war started, which shows that the Russians were perfectly right in believing that Ukraine was heading towards NATO, and that if they did not intervene in February, if they had not intervened in February 2022, sooner or later, Ukraine would indeed have become a part of NATO and would have become fully integrated in NATO's military structures. Just saying. So anyway, that's Zelensky's victory plan. And I discussed in my program yesterday how it's not really intended to be accepted by the NATO powers. What Zelensky really wants, and an article in the Financial Times all but said as much, what he really wants is a strong restatement from the Western powers, especially, of course, the United States, of support for Ukraine, of continued support for Ukraine, and for him personally, so that he can remain president of Ukraine and face down his political opponents and critics in Kiev itself, where criticism of him is in fact growing. And, well, he has cause, or so it seems to me, to want to achieve some kind of peace settlement, because we have seen that there is now increasing talk in Europe especially about the need for negotiations. President Pavel of the Czech Republic, a fervid supporter of Ukraine, has now made a speech in which he seems to say that the Ukrainians need to be realistic and consider territorial concessions to the Russians to end the war. I suspect that President Pavel has been deeply embarrassed by the failure of his plan to supply Ukraine with artillery shells bought on the international arms market. I've said that, I said at the time, and I've said since, and I continue to say, that that plan was always half-baked, that it would certainly fail, and that it would never deliver more than a fraction of the shells that were promised, and so it is proved. And I saw an article in the American media, I can't remember where, but it appeared either yesterday or the day before, which said that a very large proportion of the shells that the West has provided, they skated over where these shells had come from, but I'm guessing they come from President Pavel's package. Anyway, a large number of these shells have turned out to be duds, and that they explode when the Ukrainians try to fire them. So anyway, I think President Pavel has been badly burnt by that experience. And anyway, he's a former soldier. He has some understanding of military matters. And he's saying that Ukraine has to be realistic and cannot win the war. I think even more concerning for Zelensky and for the Ukrainians were some comments made by President Macron of France. Now, President Macron has changed his position so many times over the course of this war that I can't keep up with them. And the Russians, for their part, have lost all and every belief in him. Before the conflict, in February 2022, he appeared to be seeking a diplomatic solution Then he transformed himself into an extreme hardliner. His finance minister spoke about the need to destroy the Russian economy, or how the sanctions were intended to destroy the Russian economy, something, of course, which never happened. Subsequently, he became, after the fall of Avdiivka, the main person in the West promoting the idea of dispatching Western troops to Ukraine. That, of course, never happened. But now he is again talking about the need to reform Europe's security architecture and to see about how Europe can once again, once the war has ended, achieve a long-term sustainable peace, a modus vivendi with the Russians. Now, of course, all of this is conditional on peace in Ukraine, but it won't be what the Ukrainians want to hear. What they want to hear is continued commitments of support to them, support until a final victory is achieved. And Chancellor Scholz, reeling from more electoral setbacks, we will come to those later, has again been talking about the need to find some kind of peace solution for Ukraine, and he has again categorically ruled out Taurus missiles being supplied to Ukraine, and has made it fairly clear that he also disapproves of long-range strikes, missile strikes, deep into the territory of Ukraine. On this issue, on this specific issue of deep missile strikes into Ukraine, I get the sense that the British, amongst the major Western powers, are basically isolated. Joe Laurier at Consortium News has written a superb article about the US Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, pointing out how Tony Blinken has been an extreme hardliner, supporting extreme positions with respect to Western military support for Ukraine from the moment that the fighting began in February 2022. At one time, early in the war, he appeared to support or give the appearance of supporting the establishment of a no-fly zone over Ukraine until the Pentagon put its foot down and said no, and President Biden, using categorical language, warning of World War III, backed the Pentagon and also refused that idea. And as Joe Laurier says, Blinken also led the British along on the deep strikes. It was Blinken who led Starmer and the incoming Labour government to think that Biden and the Pentagon were open to that idea. I've discussed this myself to some extent in my programmes. Joe Laurier lays it out very clearly. The British were led along by Blinken in thinking all of that. They came and they found that, in fact, the Pentagon remains adamantly opposed. And for the moment, at least, the president himself appears to be at least reluctant to go down this route also. So the French, the Germans appear to be opposed to this idea. I cannot imagine any situation where the current French Parliament would vote for Ukraine's NATO entry, and France also reluctant to go down the route of deep missile strikes into Ukraine. Macron is saying very little about this, and Olaf Scholz strongly opposed, and opposed in a way that reflects German public opinion. So Zelensky has good reason to be nervous about what he will no doubt see as faltering support in Europe. And of course, he's also got to worry about what will happen in the United States. He's managed to say some very, I think, risky things about the Republican challenger and the Republican vice presidential challenger, J.D. Vance, specifically. All of that might not turn out well for him if the current vice president loses the election, just saying. Some might say that this is actually interference in an American election. Some might say it. Very few people I notice are. Just saying this. But anyway, he's got reasons to be concerned about the United States. He's got reasons to be concerned about the Europeans. He's proposing this extraordinary plan, which he knows won't be accepted. And he says that if it's not accepted, he intends to continue the war and continue with Plan B, which is to go on fighting with no real diplomatic or political strategy in sight. But in the meantime, even as he commits himself and Ukraine to an open-ended war with the Russians, a war which, to reiterate again, Ukraine is losing, President Zelensky rules out negotiations with the Russians. Even if Plan A is accepted, he talks about a diplomatic strategy, peace, but peace achieved without negotiations through a Russian capitulation. Anyway, maybe I'm spending too much time talking about President Zelensky, but he remains the president of Ukraine. He is, as I say, going to be speaking to Western leaders before long. I strongly suspect that he will get all the very strong statements of support that he is looking for. I suspect that he will get more assurances that one day Ukraine will indeed be inside NATO. He's probably also going to get more promises of money, though I have discussed in recent programs how the $50 billion loan plan isn't really coming together, how over the course of her recent trip to Kiev, Ursula von der Leyen promised 35 billion euros out of that $50 billion and appears to have given the impression that that was, as far as the Ukrainians were concerned, money in the bank, when, of course, it is not. There is no guarantee that European parliaments will approve this plan. Anyway, he will probably nonetheless get some more money. There is still some money apparently available in the United States from the previous appropriation left to give him. He will get some more weapons. He might, on the edges, be able to get some agreement for deep strikes on Russia. I don't think that is a good idea at all, however limited it is, and I get the sense that the Pentagon remains very opposed, but Blinken will no doubt advocate for it, and the President himself is, in my opinion, in a difficult position to make decisions. I'm being very careful what I say here. Anyway, but Plan A will not bear fruit, and what Zelensky therefore offers is indefinite Plan B. Indefinite war, which, to be very clear now, means war until Russia's victory. Because militarily, there can be no other outcome. Now, let's turn to the military situation, where, as I said, there's been dramatic developments. Firstly, over the last couple of hours, there have been reports that the Russians have now entered Vuhledar. Now, I say this with some care, because a few weeks ago, there were reports also circulating from some of the same sources that are providing the latest reports about the Russians having entered Vuhledar at that particular time. And that turned out not to be the case. The Russians were conducting attacks on all kinds of positions around Vuhledar, but at that point, at that time, they hadn't yet actually taken action to enter the town itself. Now we're getting more reports that they have, and I think this time these reports probably are true. And I say that because on every other position around Vuhledar, the Ukrainians find themselves in a far worse position than they did when those earlier incorrect reports of a Russian advance into Vuhledar were being spread. Briefly, it seems almost certain now that the Russians have captured not just on South Donbass number 3, the coal mine northwest of Vodyane, but that they have also completed the capture of South Donbass number 1, the coal mine close to Vuhledar itself. They have undertaken significant advances north of Prichistovka, the village that they captured about 2 weeks ago. This village lies to the west of Vuhledar. There are films now which show Russian tanks and armoured vehicles advancing through the fields, practically unopposed as far as I can see. The Russians are bombing heavily Novoukrainka and other villages in the area around Vuhledar. And as far as I can tell, they have cut all the main supply roads to Vuhledar itself. There are still country roads, dirt roads, that the Ukrainians could use, both to send people to Vuhledar, though I can't imagine they could send heavy supplies down these country roads, and also perhaps to withdraw some of their men from Vuhledar. But increasingly, and by the hour, that is becoming more difficult. And given the impossible supply situation for Vuhledar, briefly, I think that a sustained defense of that town is now all but impossible. I heard claims over the last 24 hours that the Ukrainians have indeed pulled the 92nd Brigade out of Vuhledar, and that the troops who are defending Vuhledar are from Ukraine's territorial defense. In other words, far less well-trained forces mobilized since the conflict began in February 2022, lacking the discipline and drive and motivation of the men of the 92nd Brigade. I would say straight away that if that is true, that is an extremely cynical operation. If the Ukrainians were going to withdraw the 92nd Brigade from Vuhledar because they realized that Vuhledar was going to fall, then frankly, it is utterly cynical and completely ruthless to replace the 92nd Brigade in a position which is about to be lost with the men of territorial defense battalions who will be trapped and quite probably lose their lives. The calculus seems to me ruthless and cynical beyond imagination. And if it is true, then frankly it is horrifying, and it does make me question again not just the logic, but indeed the ethics of some of the decisions that the Ukrainian command is making. But I'm not actually sure that the 92nd Brigade has in fact been withdrawn from Vuhledar. I read an article, I think it was in Forbes, that the 92nd Brigade is in fact still in Vuhledar and is actually cut off. I don't know that necessarily that this is true, and it may be that Forbes, or wherever it was that I read it, have got this wrong. But for the record, I rather think that the 92nd Brigade is still in Vuhledar. I think that, well, I'd like to believe that the Ukrainians are not as callous and as cynical as to withdraw that brigade and send territorial defense troops to take its place in a battle, in a place that's going to be lost. I would like to believe that. I'm afraid I now have serious doubts whether the Ukrainians would in fact show that kind of, shall we say, show that kind of restraint. But in fact, I rather suspect that the 97th Brigade is still there, because I see no proof, none, that it has in fact been withdrawn from Vuhledar at all. Anyway, one way or the other, we are coming to the end of this battle. Vuhledar is likely to fall. There were some claims yesterday that the Ukrainians were planning to pull out of Vuhledar. It looks as if they're still minded to make a fight of it, but the Russians look like they've entered the town. Quite plausibly, the defences will crumble. In area, this is actually a relatively small place, though easily defendable because it consists almost entirely of high-rise buildings. But of course, these have been heavily bombed and shelled now. Anyway, one way or the other, it is likely that Vuhledar will fall, and quite plausibly, the collapse, when it comes in Vuhledar, will be sudden. And once Vuhledar falls, I suspect all the surrounding villages will fall to Russian control very rapidly, and at that point the Russians will be able to advance on Kurachovo. In fact, they will be close to Kurachovo from the southwest, and the battle for Kurachovo, a much bigger and more important town, the battle for Kurachovo will begin in earnest. Anyway, to repeat again a point I've made many times, the battle for Vuhledar is now intimately connected to the Battle of Kurachovo, and the Battle of Kurachovo itself is part of the battle for Pokrovsk. And in this area, Kurachovo, Pokrovsk, Selidovo, we're getting more reports now of further Russian advances. There were reports this morning, which I cannot confirm, but believe to be true, that the village of Zelanye Drucha, the village to the south of Zelanye Pershe, has now been captured in its entirety by the Russians. The Russians apparently are in control of a significant part of Girnik, or Gornyak, I believe the Russians call it. Anyway, this is a town south of Ukrainsk, which of course the Russians captured a few days ago. The Russians are advancing, apparently, very close now to the other village of Tsukurinye, or apparently I'm mispronouncing the name of that village. Tsukurinye is apparently closer to its correct pronunciation. But they've captured the coal mine to the north and the slag heap to the north, and they're about to begin a storming operation of Tsukurinye, all of which will have a major impact on operations in Selidovo itself. There's been heavy fighting in Selidovo. The Ukrainians still trying to defend Selidovo. They still see it as an important position that they presumably feel they have to hold. Probably they realize that if Selidovo is captured by the Russians, then all of the Ukrainian defense lines south of Pokrovsk, such as they are, will crumble. But more importantly, if Selidovo falls, the Russians will have an open route to advance towards Kurachovo from the north and the Kurachovo reservoir, because it is Selidovo which in effect continues to lie in their way. It is like a kind of bone in their throat, if you will. But Selidovo will fall, and it will fall fairly quickly. Now, we've had further news further north. The Russians they still haven't, the Russian Defense Ministry still hasn't confirmed the capture of Grodivka, though all the maps from all the various mapping projects are essentially showing that. The Russians are continuing, however, to advance from Grodivka. Yesterday, I said that they'd captured the village of Krasny Yar, north of Kruty Yar. I believed myself that they'd been in control of Krasny Yar for some time, and what we've just had is some photo confirmation of this. But anyway, the Russians apparently advancing not from Krasny Yar, interestingly, but from Grodivka, have begun an attack on the village immediately to the south of Mirnograd, which is Mykolaievka, and they have apparently captured already some of the buildings in this village, and it is likely that they will capture the rest of that village fairly quickly. So that will bring the Russians very, very close to Mirnograd itself. And of course, the Russians are shelling Pokrovsk and Mirnograd heavily, as I've discussed in recent programs. They've cut off all the big supply roads to Pokrovsk. They've also cut the railway lines to Pokrovsk. The Ukrainians themselves admit that Pokrovsk's time as a logistical hub has already ended. And I suspect once Selidovo is captured, and once some of the villages to the west and northwest of Selidovo, Lisivka and Suche Yar, places located to the west of Novogrodivka, once all of these places are captured, the Russians will then begin preparations for the assault on Pokrovsk itself. That could involve, before then, a clearing operation of the remaining villages under Ukrainian control to the east of Mirnograd, places like Vozvizhenka, Novoekonomichka, and places like this. So the battle for Pokrovsk just over the horizon, the battle for Kurakhovo just over the horizon as well. And whilst it is still possible to see routes for the Ukrainian troops in Pokrovsk to retreat, the Russians have not yet taken positions north of Pokrovsk, for example. So Pokrovsk is not fully surrounded, and the Ukrainians could withdraw from Pokrovsk and preserve most of their forces. In the case of Kurakhovo, once Vuhledar falls, the situation could very easily evolve into a cauldron, a massive envelopment operation, which will not just take in the Ukrainian troops in Kurakhovo itself, but which could lead to the destruction of all of the Ukrainian forces in southwestern Donbass. Now, that's the major battle going on at the moment, this huge battle playing out all the way from Vuhledar in the south, all the way up north to Pokrovsk. But it could be that equally dramatic things are going to start happening soon further west, because there have been reports that the Russian forces have been starting to creep up northward from Robotyno towards Orechov, and the Russians, importantly, have begun shelling the great city of Zaporozhye on the Dnieper River. And I understand that this is now artillery, actual Russian artillery, that is being used. Must be very long-range artillery, if it is true. But the Russians are bombing and shelling the great city of Zaporozhye itself. And apparently, Russian drones are now operating over Zaporozhye. And I'm going to guess that these are the big Orion and Sirius drones, the drones that resemble America's Predator and Reaper drones, because we have film in which we see these drones, these Russian drones. We don't actually see the drones themselves. The footage has been made by the drones. Anyway, these drones are apparently launching air-to-ground missiles against targets inside Zaporozhye. And strikingly, again, there is no visible sign of any Ukrainian air defense over Zaporozhye, despite the fact that we're talking about a city of 1 million people. It was actually more than that at one time. One of Ukraine's biggest industrial centers, place where gas turbine and aircraft engines used to be built. Motor vehicles used to be built as well, including volume passenger cars, all kinds of things. And a major industrial center of Ukraine, by far the biggest city, the Russians would have attacked. And as I said, as far as I can see, it's been stripped of its air defenses because Russian drones appear to be operating over it without hindrance. And it isn't just Zaporozhye, but the nearby city of Nikopol, a much smaller place than Zaporozhye, but an older one. Again, it's a Greek name. It means the city of victory. Just saying, which strongly suggests to me that it is another creation of Catherine the Great and her Prime Minister, Prince Potyomkin. All these Greek names that were given to all of these towns in this sort of area basically originate with Catherine and Potyomkin. Anyway, the city of Nikopol is now also being attacked. It's located on the Ukrainian-controlled northwest bank of the Dnieper, not very far from Vuhledar and the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, which is located on the southeastern, Russian-controlled southeastern bank of the Dnieper, just saying. But anyway, the same big Russian drones launching their missiles and their bombs appear to be operating over Nikopol as well. And Nikopol apparently is also being shelled. So who knows? Maybe the Russians are about to activate their forces in this area. The 130,000 men of the Dnieper group of forces, commanded by General Terpinsky, one of the most effective and brilliant commanders of the Russian army. They've been standing still for some months now. Maybe they're about to go into action. And maybe once Vuhledar falls, maybe that's what they've been waiting for, because Vuhledar has been a thorn on the side of the Russians. It's been able to prevent advances by the Russians northward, because it's located on the flanks of any Russian northern advance. It interferes with railway movement in this area. Maybe once Vuhledar has fallen, with all the railway lines under Russian control, with new railway lines created to the south by the Russians along the seashore, maybe the moment will have come for a major Russian offensive towards Zaporozhye and Nikopol and all of these places, which at this stage could be decisive in the war. And anyway, all of that is happening in southern Ukraine, this titanic battle being fought out there. And, well, elsewhere, for the Ukrainians, the news is proving just as bad. Now, there's been film from Toretsk which shows the Ukrainians, it's widely assumed that it is the Ukrainians, demolishing a tall industrial structure in an important coal mine area in the central part of Toretsk. And there's been suggestions that this is a sign that the Ukrainians are evacuating the center of Toretsk. Now, if that is true, then I am going to suggest that it will be one further example of how the Russians must have advanced and penetrated far more deeply inside Toretsk than any one of the mapping projects have suggested up to this time. It would mean that this area where this structure has been destroyed has become undefendable, and almost certainly it has become undefendable because the Russians are close to encircling it and are about to conduct a storming operation. And for that to be the case, the Russians must have gained control of a significant part of the area of the high-rise buildings at the center of Toretsk, and must have advanced much deeper and further into Toretsk than any reports have suggested up to this time. Having said this, we haven't got proof of that. That's just a deduction. Maybe we'll have to wait and see. But the fact that this building is being destroyed, and apparently is being destroyed by the Ukrainians, not by the Russians, it seems that it's possible to tell from the way in which a building falls. Actually, there's no doubt about this. You can tell from the way a building falls whether it's the result of demolition, deliberate demolition, or the result of bombing and enemy action. So the fact that the Ukrainians are destroying these buildings, very high-rise, high buildings, which if they were to fall under Russian control, would provide the Russians with outstanding observation points, which would enable them to survey the entire landscape right up northward towards Konstantinovka. The fact that the Ukrainians are intent, apparently, on depriving the Russians of these sort of buildings, that suggests that Toretsk, the defense of Toretsk, is much closer to collapse than most reporting projects perhaps realize. And I'm going to suggest that the same is true of Chasiv Yar, though again, we've heard less information from Chasiv Yar. I personally would not be surprised if the next piece of news we get from Chasiv Yar is one which shows all the main positions in Chasiv Yar under Russian control, and which confirms that Chasiv Yar itself is about to fall. So, further north still, in the area, what might be called the Slavyansk area, the area of the southern area, close to Liman, which is located on the west of the Zherebets River. This area where the Russians have recently captured the village of Makeyevka and the village of Nevsky. There's reports that the Russians have advanced and captured another village, Torskia, which is located also on the Zherebets River, but significantly to the south of Makeyevka and Nevsky. In fact, it's located to the south of the village of Terny, where there was intense fighting back in the spring, and Terny, of course, remains under Ukrainian control. So it looks as if the Russians have conducted some kind of advance across the fields, if this is true, and have captured this village, Torskia. And the point is that Torskia is very close to Liman. Liman is only some distance from Torskia, but on the other side of the Zherebets River. And the Zherebets River, well, we're approaching the period of the autumn rains. It's not a big river. In the summer, I suspect that men could actually ford it. But in the autumn, most probably that would not be possible. But many Russian armoured vehicles can move across water, they can ford across water, and they can float across water. But I think anyway that the Russians will build pontoon bridges across the Zherebets River. It's a relatively small river, and they can do it very quickly and very easily. And I suspect that that is most likely what will happen. And obviously, the Russians will at some point take this territory between Toretsk and Nevsky and Makeyevka under control as well, which will give them control of most of the east bank of the Zherebets River. Now, the fact that the Russians are making all these moves close to Liman suggests to me that the Ukrainian positions in Siversk, a little to the southeast, are deteriorating. Siversk is, to say it simply, in a salient. It has been that before, but the Russians never made a serious attempt in 2022 when they occupied all of these places that we're talking about, Toretsk, Makeyevka, all of them, Liman. They never made a serious attempt to attack and capture Siversk, which, looking back, was a sign that things were not entirely well with the state of the Russian army in the conflict area at that time, something which Ukraine's successful counteroffensive in Kharkiv subsequently made clear. Well, the situation today is very, very different. Nobody doubts that the Russians this time are very strong. And the fact that the Russians appear to be taking all these positions east of the Zherebets River, they've also, of course, crossed the Zherebets River in Makeyevka and some say in Nevsky as well, and they've already established the bridgehead there. The fact that they're making all these moves around on the Zherebets River suggests to me that they believe themselves, the Russians believe to themselves, to be very close to capturing Siversk as well. We're probably going to see at some point over the next few weeks a major assault on Siversk and probably the fall of the town, whose supply situation must now be becoming increasingly difficult. Well, further north still, in the Kupiansk area, there's more reports of the Russians gradually gaining control of more and more territory southwest of Kupiansk. It's always very easy to tell exactly what the Russians are planning to do, but they do seem to be gradually clearing the east bank of the Oskol River, which is the river that lies to the north. I still believe that they're waiting to sort out the Battle of Volchansk further north. The Russians, a group of forces north, are telling us that the Ukrainians made a further attack in Volchansk, trying to push the Russians back, but that it was defeated. And recent bulletins from group of forces north rather suggest that, as I said, the area of the high-rise buildings in Volchansk is finally passing under Russian control. And, well, there are reports from the Kursk area that even as the Russians advance towards Plekhovo in the southeast of Sudzha, Plekhovo, right on the Russian border, even as they advance towards Svedlikovo, northeast of Sudzha, again on the Ukrainian-Russian border, preparing, in other words, to encircle the Ukrainian pocket. Well, the Ukrainians are reporting or making claims that they have now recaptured the village of Malaya Loknya. Now, I have seen no film or footage or photographs so far that confirms that claim. I'm not saying necessarily it is wrong. It may be that the Russians have made a decision that since they are on the brink of cutting off this entire pocket from resupply, that it makes little sense for them to sacrifice men defending a place like Malaya Lognia, which is only a village, small village after all. So it could be that the Russians made a decision to pull back from Malaya Lognia because this place has lost its importance. But I'm going to be a bit careful because it's also clear that the Ukrainian attacks further west in the Glushkovo area of Kursk have been unsuccessful, and it may be that the Ukrainians are spreading stories that Malaya Lognia has passed under their control to make up for the fact that their operation in Glushkovo has up to now been a complete failure. Anyway, we'll just have to wait and see. So in the meantime, the situation on the front lines for the Ukrainians gets worse and worse. There is this huge battle playing out. Vuhledar, Kurakhovo, Selidovo, Pokrovsk. They should all be understood, as I said, in my opinion, as one great battle in which the Russians are clearly winning, the Ukrainian forces barely able to hold on. The Russians, perhaps now, on the brink of capturing Toretsk, if the deductions of perhaps the Ukrainian demolition of this high-rise building in the coal mining area in central Toretsk are true. Growing reports or growing indications that the Russians are about to begin a major offensive of their own in the Zaporozhye area. Maybe, just possibly, this offensive will begin in earnest either when the rains come, with the Ukrainians unable to use the roads because their vehicles are not adapted to the conditions of the Rasputitsa, and that will make Ukrainian supply movements more difficult. Or alternatively, the Russians have problems moving large numbers of troops during the period of the Rasputitsa. Maybe the Russians will wait until November, when the Rasputitsa has ended and the ground has hardened. We'll just have to wait and see. But anyway, one way or the other, rumblings that some great battle for Zaporozhye is about to begin. And in Moscow, they are working hard on the forthcoming BRICS summit meeting in Kazan, due to take place on the 23rd or 24th of October, or perhaps both of those days. And as far as I can see, the Russians, obviously aware of all of the intrigues taking place in Kiev, aware of Zelensky's moves in New York, but the Russians perhaps feeling that the pressure on them to agree to negotiations has eased, and that they can just therefore let the military do its job in the conflict zone and win the war, and that they don't really need to become distracted by all that's been going on the diplomatic front. I say that because Russian officials have again ruled out any idea that Russia will participate in any peace summit, which is something else that Zelensky has been promoting. It's not clear yet, by the way, whether there will be a peace summit. Apparently it's supposed to take place in November. Switzerland has said that it will not host it. Zelensky's been trying to get either the Indians or the Saudis to host it. I get the sense that neither the Indians nor the Saudis, both important to remember BRICS countries, are at all enthusiastic about that idea. Anyway, the Russians have just said that they will not attend. They see no reason why they would. The entire purpose of these peace summits is to maneuver countries into putting pressure on them to agree to Zelensky's peace proposal, the capitulation of Russia, and its unconditional withdrawal from all the territories which the Russians gained control of after 2014. The Russians have again categorically ruled that out, and they say that since this is the only purpose of these so-called peace plans or peace conferences, there is really no point in them turning up. All that would do is legitimize Zelensky's peace plan, give the impression that it is worth discussing, and the Russians are not interested in discussing it. If that is, given that rather that the Russians are taking that stance, I am interpreting that to mean that the diplomatic pressure on them has eased again, that after the strong words by Putin at the Eastern Economic Forum and by Lavrov, the Brazilians and the Indians have backed off. Anyway, there we are. That's the situation in Ukraine. I'm going to finish this program by discussing the regional elections in Brandenburg. And I think before I do this, these are in Germany, of course, where the SPD, the governing party in Germany, just managed to hold on as the biggest party with, I believe it was 30.2% of the vote. The AfD got just under 30% of the vote. The two parties are almost level. The BSW, Sarah Wagenknecht's party, came third with 13% of the vote, so it holds the balance of power in effect. The CDU came fourth with 8%, so I also understand. And, well, the Greens and the FPD, apparently they got so few votes that they're not going to be represented in the regional parliament. Now, there's a number of things to be said about the vote in Brandenburg. Firstly, the first thing to say is that Brandenburg is a very historic area in terms of German history. It is essentially the territory around Berlin, the capital. So it is the heart of Prussia, what eventually became the Kingdom of Prussia. In fact, the Hohenzollern family, who eventually became first kings of Prussia and then German emperors, never, by the way, contrary to what people say, emperors of Germany. The official title was German emperor. Anyway, just saying. Anyway, the kings of Prussia, they were, by the way, just as a historical curiosity, firstly, they were kings in Prussia. Then they became kings of Prussia. Then they became German emperors. But before they became king in Prussia in the 17th century, they were the Markgrafs, Mercouris of Brandenburg. And this was their core territory. And its location of famous towns like Potsdam, for example, very heavily associated with Frederick the Great, famous king of Prussia. And of course, Potsdam has also come to be associated in many people's minds, firstly with the Potsdam Conference that Stalin, Churchill and Roosevelt held at the end of the war in Europe in 1940, not Roosevelt, Truman. Roosevelt was dead. But anyway, that the victorious Allies held at the end of the Second World War, after the defeat of Germany, but before the defeat of Japan. And Potsdam is also associated in some minds, perhaps rather unfairly, with Prussian militarism and all of that. Well, it may surprise people, given all of this history, if I say that Brandenburg has always been and continues to be a very left-wing region in Germany. In fact, a core left-wing region of Germany, as, by the way, Berlin is. Berlin has always been, in German political terms, a city that is politically very strongly aligned with the left. That was true during the time of the German Empire. It was during the period of the Weimar Republic, and it continues to be true to this day. So this is a very, very left-wing part of the world, at least part of Germany. And for that reason, it has been the region in Eastern Germany which has been historically dominated by the SPD. And this is, I believe I'm right in saying that it is the only region of the former East Germany where the SPD has been electorally successful. And quite often, the SPD, the party that's challenged it in Brandenburg, has not been the CDU, which has always found it difficult to make much running in Brandenburg, but Die Linke, the left-wing party, which evolved, well, basically out of the East German Communist Party. Anyway, one would expect the left to be successful in Brandenburg. So the fact that the AfD has won almost 30% of the vote in Brandenburg is actually unprecedented. It is astonishing. It is another electoral breakthrough. And there is a further factor which underlines the extent of the AfD's success, which is that I understand that the AfD outpolled the SPD in every age group below 60. It was the older voters who continued to vote for the establishment parties in Brandenburg. Below 60, the trend in Brandenburg was to vote either for the AfD or increasingly for the new left-wing party, the BSW, led by Sarah Wagenknecht, which came third with 13%, which is another astonishing result, by the way, given that this is a party which has only just been established and which has no strong organisation. But anyway, let's talk about them in a moment. So, every demographic below the age of 60 tended to vote for these anti-establishment parties. And I understand that amongst young voters in Brandenburg, voters between the ages of 18 and 24, the most strongly supported party was again the AfD. Now this is, as I said, cumulatively remarkable. It represents an earthquake in German politics. The fact that some people are relieved that the SPD just managed to squeak through a win needs to understand that in this area, the SPD should not be under threat at all, and certainly not under threat from a party of the right, as the AfD is always said to be. That's the first thing to say. Now, the second is that the reason the SPD won was not just because they managed to get the older people to vote for them, but because of tactical voting that worked to their advantage. I've said that the SPD, the Liberal Democrats and the Greens, saw a total collapse, that they're not represented in the regional parliament. The reason is that any remaining voters of these parties who still support those parties heeded the call to come and vote for the SPD to prevent the disgrace of the AfD winning in Brandenburg. And the last point to make is that the local leadership of the SPD, the local regional government, which, by the way, I've heard has done a reasonably good job. I'm not there, and maybe people in Brandenburg will come along and tell me that that's wrong. But I believe it's been a relatively efficient local government. Anyway, they went out of their way to distance themselves from Chancellor Scholz and the leadership of the SPD in Berlin. So, this is another electoral shock. It's an electoral shock that Olaf Scholz is likely to survive, simply because his party just squeaked through a win. And contrary to all the oceans of literature that I've been reading about this, I think the Russians, if we're talking about the Russians, if we're looking at this election purely in terms of Russian interests, I think they would rather Scholz remain chancellor than not. Because if Brandenburg had been lost by the SPD, and if, as some expected, that had caused Scholz to step down, then most likely his replacement would have been Boris Pistorius, who is the current German defense minister. He is known to take a very, very hardline position on Russia, and it might just be the case that he might have shifted Germany's position on questions like deep missile strikes against Russia or supplies of Taurus missiles or things of that kind. I'm not saying, by the way, that he necessarily would have done. He would have been swimming against the tide of German opinion had he done so. But anyway, Scholz, for what it's worth, limps on. So does his government, though it is now essentially a collection of angry parties, furious with each other, constantly maneuvering and battling against each other. And we can see that the electoral momentum continues to be with the AfD and with Sarah Wagenknecht. As for the reasons for that, well, I discussed them at length a couple of weeks ago after the elections in Saxony and Thuringia. The German economy is in bad shape. Deindustrialization processes in Germany are accelerating. Since the elections in Thuringia and Saxony, we have had reports that Volkswagen, the mighty German automaker, Volkswagen, which once bestrode the European car industry like a colossus, is thinking of closing car factories in Germany, something which has never happened before, and at least not done by a German company before. I remember that Opel, which is of course at one time owned by General Motors, they did it, but Volkswagen has never done it. Anyway, that has been a major shock in Germany, and we've had more reports that more of the chemicals industry and other heavy industries are also closing, and that Germany could very well be in recession again. And there's all of the other problems that Germany has been facing, the immigration problems, and again, in order to prevent the defeat in Brandenburg, Scholz effectively suspended the Schengen rules. The Poles are furious with him over that by imposing tough border controls, and maybe that was just enough to also help the SPD squeak across the line in Brandenburg. It wouldn't surprise me, though I don't think it would have moved many votes or persuaded many people, just saying. But anyway, there's all of those problems, and looming over everything, there is the war and Germany's role in it. And I think that by this point, it's become increasingly obvious the German public opinion, which was pulled along by all the hysteria at the beginning, that they've now lost confidence, they've lost belief, they no longer support the war as they once did. They want a peaceful solution to the war, and first and foremost and above all, they want Germany out of it. And of course there are other factors. There's the energy policy the government has followed under the influence of the Greens and all of those things. All of this cumulatively points to a growing malaise, and it is a malaise which is affecting Germany, and it is affecting Europe, and which is causing the SPD to lose ground in places like Brandenburg, and which is leading to AfD breakthroughs in the East German Länder and to the rise of Sarah Wagenknecht's party. Anyway, a historic event. As I said, this election in Brandenburg is a remarkable event. And to repeat what I have said, I believe it is only a matter of time before Sarah Wagenknecht's party, the BSW, starts to break through in Western Germany as well. Hamburg might be an interesting place to look at. It's another place, port city with a very strong left-wing culture and tradition. In the 1920s, the KPD, the former Communist Party of Germany, was quite strong there. So Hamburg might be a place to look at. So might be some of the places in the Ruhr and other places in northern Germany, and conceivably even Munich, just saying. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say about the situation today. By the way, just to add that if Scholz had any ideas of agreeing that Ukraine join NATO or authorizing deep missile strikes into Russia, well, he will now have been disabused. The German public opinion is absolutely not in favor of these things. Anyway, that's me for today. A longer program today, as I said. Let me remind you once more, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop where we have all these amazing shirts that we're all wearing at the moment, Alex and myself. Links under this video. And last but not least, if you've liked this program, remember please to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.